For 11 years, Jennifer Ravenel refused to hold another cat. Not because she didn't want to, but because her heart simply couldn't do it again. Not after losing Sam, and then, after a decade of silence, her phone rang. A voice on the other end said, "Ma'am, we think we found him." Just 1 mile from where he disappeared. She thought it was a joke, a prank, or a mistake. But what she was about to experience felt like a miracle. This is the story of Sam the kitty cat man, and the 11 years that almost broke a woman's heart, and the phone call that put it back together. It started on a morning in late spring of 2011, the kind of morning that exists only in the South Carolina Low Country in May. The air was thick and warm before 7 a.m., carrying the smell of jasmine from the trellis by the back porch, and something green and alive from the woods at the edge of her property. Jennifer had been up since dawn, the way she always was, because sleep had become difficult after the divorce, and early mornings were easier than lying in bed waiting for a day to start that she wasn't sure she wanted. She was a potter, had been for 30 years, ever since she'd taken a class at the community college on a whim, and discovered that putting her hands in clay was the only thing that quieted the noise in her head. Her studio was a converted shed behind the farmhouse, and she spent most of her days there, throwing bowls and mugs and the occasional vase that she sold at farmers markets and craft fairs around Charleston. It wasn't a living exactly. The divorce settlement covered most of her expenses, but it was a life. It was hers. And on mornings like this one, walking her property in the soft golden light, she could almost convince herself that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. She was checking the fence line at the back of the pasture when she heard it, a sound so small and thin it barely registered over the birdsong and the distant hum of insects, a mewing, tiny and desperate and coming from somewhere above her head. She stopped walking and listened, and there it was again, a kitten's cry, the kind of sound that bypasses your brain entirely and goes straight to something older, something that makes you move before you've decided to. She looked up into the branches of an old live oak, the kind that grows everywhere in the Low Country, all twisted limbs and Spanish moss and shadows. And there, wedged into a crook where 2 branches met about 12 feet off the ground, was a kitten, gray tabby, white paws, white chest. Couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old and clearly terrified. His eyes were huge in his tiny face, and when he saw her looking up at him, he mewed again with a desperation that made her chest hurt. Jennifer went back to the house and got the ladder from the barn. She carried it across the field, which took longer than she wanted because the ladder was aluminum but still awkward, and the ground was uneven, and she wasn't as young as she used to be. By the time she got back to the tree, the kitten had stopped crying, exhausted probably, or maybe just resigned to whatever was going to happen next. She leaned the ladder against the trunk and started climbing, talking the whole way up. Because that's what you do with scared animals. You talk to them. You let them know a voice is coming before a hand does. "Hey there, little one. Hey, sweet thing. I'm coming up, okay? I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help. You're stuck, aren't you? You climbed up, and now you can't get down. And that's scary, I know. But I've got you. I'm going to get you out of there." When she reached the branch where he was wedged, she could see how thin he was. His ribs were visible through his fur, and his coat was dull and patchy in places. A feral kitten, probably, born to one of the wild cats that lived in the woods around here. Too young to be away from his mother, but somehow separated anyway. He watched her with those huge, terrified eyes as she reached toward him, and she half expected him to scratch or bite, the way feral cats do when they're cornered. But he didn't. He just looked at her, and when her hand closed gently around his tiny body, he went limp. Not dead. She could feel his heart hammering against her palm, fast as a hummingbird's, but surrendered. Like he'd decided to trust her, or at least to stop fighting. She tucked him inside her flannel shirt against the warmth of her chest and climbed down one-handed. It wasn't safe, and she knew it, but she also knew she wasn't letting go of this kitten until they were both on solid ground. When her feet hit the grass, she stood there for a moment, feeling his tiny body trembling against her skin, feeling the flutter of his breath, feeling something shift inside her that she couldn't name yet, but would come to understand as the beginning of everything. She named him Sam, Sam the kitty cat man, because she liked the rhythm of it, liked the way it felt in her mouth, liked having a name to call out loud in a house that had been too quiet for too long. She fed him kitten formula from a dropper for the first week because he was too young to eat solid food, setting her alarm for every 4 hours like she was nursing an infant. She made him a bed in a cardboard box lined with an old sweater, and she put the box next to her bed so she could hear him if he cried in the night. And he did cry those first few nights. Tiny mews that sounded like questions. Where am I? Where's my mother? What's happening? And Jennifer would reach down and put her hand in the box, and he would press his face against her fingers and go quiet, and eventually go back to sleep. By the second week, he was eating solid food, soft kitten food that she mashed with a fork until it was almost liquid. By the third week, he was exploring the house, wobbly on his legs but curious about everything. By the fourth week, he had claimed the sunny spot on the kitchen windowsill as his own. And Jennifer had stopped setting alarms because he slept through the night now, curled at the foot of her bed like he'd always been there. She took him to the vet in late June, a routine checkup to make sure he was healthy and to get his first round of vaccinations. The vet was a young woman, brisk and efficient, who pronounced Sam underweight but otherwise fine, and recommended a diet of high-calorie kitten food to get him up to size. At the end of the appointment, almost as an afterthought, she asked if Jennifer wanted to get him microchipped. It's a tiny chip, goes just under the skin, between his shoulder blades. If he ever gets lost and someone brings him to a shelter or a vet, they can scan the chip and find your contact information. It's about $45, but it lasts his whole life. Jennifer looked down at Sam, who was sitting on the exam table, looking mildly annoyed at being poked and prodded. He never goes anywhere, she thought. He's an indoor cat. What's the point? But then she thought about the woods at the edge of her property, and the coyotes she sometimes heard at night, and the cars on the road half a mile away, and she thought about how small he was, how easy it would be to lose him, how quickly something you loved could disappear if you weren't careful. Sure, she said, let's do it, just in case. The vet inserted the chip with a needle that made Sam hiss once and then forget about it immediately. Jennifer paid the bill, carried Sam out to her truck, and drove home without giving it another thought, just in case. She'd probably never need it. He never went anywhere. The 2 years that followed were the happiest Jennifer could remember in a long time. Not because anything dramatic happened, nothing did, but because Sam was there, and having him there changed everything. The house didn't feel empty anymore. The mornings didn't feel like something to be endured. The evenings, which had been the hardest since the divorce, were now her favorite part of the day, because that's when she would sit on the porch with a glass of wine, and Sam would curl up in her lap, and they would watch the light fade together over the trees. He followed her everywhere. When she went to her studio to throw pots, he came with her and slept on the old armchair in the corner, covered in dried clay slip that she never bothered to clean because it was his chair now, his spot. When she worked in the garden, he sat in the shade nearby and watched her with those intelligent eyes, occasionally pouncing on a grasshopper or a butterfly that wandered too close. When she cooked dinner, he sat on the kitchen counter. She knew you weren't supposed to let cats on the counter, but she lived alone, and who was going to tell her no? And supervised her every move with the intensity of a head chef inspecting a line cook. She talked to him constantly, not baby talk, not the high-pitched cooing that some people used with pets, but real conversation. She told him about her day, about the pots she was making, about the weather and the garden and the chickens she'd been thinking about getting. She asked his opinions on things. What should she have for dinner? Should she go to the farmer's market this weekend? Did he think it was going to rain? And Sam would meow at what seemed like appropriate moments, and she would laugh and tell him he was the best listener she'd ever known, which was true. He was. He never interrupted, never judged, never tried to fix her problems. He just listened, and that was more than most people in her life had ever done. If you've never loved an animal this completely, it might be hard to understand. It might seem like too much emotion for a pet, too much attachment for something that can't speak, can't understand, can't love you back in human ways. But anyone who's ever shared their life with an animal knows that's not true. They do love you back. They just speak a different language. And when you learn that language, when you learn to read the slow blink that means I trust you, the head bump that means you're mine, the purr that means I'm happy here with you right now, you understand that this isn't a lesser love. It's just a quieter one. And sometimes the quiet ones are the deepest. And then came the day everything changed. It was an ordinary afternoon in the summer of 2013. Nothing special about it, nothing that suggested disaster was coming. Jennifer was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the tomato plants, and Sam was doing what Sam always did, lying in the shade a few feet away, keeping her company without getting in the way. The sun was high and hot, the air was thick with humidity, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire of stolen songs. A neighbor's dog came through the gap in the fence, a big yellow lab, friendly and dumb and absolutely delighted to find a cat in the yard. He wasn't aggressive. Jennifer could see that immediately. He was just a dog who wanted to play, who didn't understand that cats don't play the way dogs do, who was barreling toward Sam with his tongue hanging out and his tail wagging like this was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Sam panicked. He was a cat who had never been around dogs, who had spent his entire life on this quiet farm where the biggest threat was a particularly bold mockingbird. The dog was enormous and fast and terrifying, and Sam did the only thing his instincts told him to do. He ran. Jennifer saw it happen like time had slowed down. Sam's gray body streaking across the yard, the dog giving chase, not understanding, just playing. Sam hitting the tree line at the edge of the property and vanishing into the green shadows of the woods like smoke dissolving into air. The sound of crashing in the underbrush getting fainter and fainter, and then silence. The neighbor came running over, apologizing, grabbing the dog's collar, saying it got out of the yard, saying it would never happen again. Jennifer barely heard any of it. She was already moving toward the woods, already calling Sam's name, already feeling the first cold fingers of fear wrap around her throat. She searched until she couldn't see. She pushed through briars that tore at her arms and brambles that caught at her clothes, and she called his name until her voice was raw and broken. Sam, 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 the kitty cat man. Where are you? Come back, please come back. The woods swallowed her voice and gave nothing in return. By the time full dark came, she was standing at the tree line, mud on her knees and scratches on her hands and tears streaming down her face, and she was alone. She told herself he would come back. Cats ran when they were scared. That's what cats did. But they came back when they calmed down, when they got hungry, when they remembered where home was. He would be on the porch in the morning, she told herself, waiting for breakfast like nothing had happened. Annoyed, probably, at her for letting that dog into the yard. But when morning came, the porch was empty. She searched every day for weeks. She walked those woods until she knew every tree, every fallen log, every hollow where a cat might hide. She put up flyers at every store and gas station within 10 miles. Lost cat, gray tabby with white paws. Answers to Sam, reward. She knocked on doors, showed his picture to anyone who would look, asked if they'd seen him, if they'd heard anything, if they had any idea where a scared cat might go. Nobody had seen him. Nobody knew anything. The woods were big, and the world was bigger, and a single gray cat could disappear into it so easily. She called the shelters, Charleston County Animal Control, the local Humane Society, every rescue organization in the area. She gave them his description, his microchip number, her phone number. She checked their websites every morning and every night, scrolling through pictures of found cats, hoping to see his face, dreading the possibility that she might find him in the wrong kind of listing. She did everything you're supposed to do when a pet goes missing. She did everything right. None of it worked. The first year without Sam was a wound that wouldn't close. Jennifer would wake in the morning and reach down to feel for him at the foot of the bed, and her hand would find only cold sheets. She would make her coffee and pour cream into 2 mugs out of habit, one for her, one to cool on the counter, while Sam wove between her legs waiting for his morning treat. And then she would stand there staring at the second mug, remembering, and have to pour it out because she couldn't drink it and couldn't look at it and couldn't throw it away, because throwing it away felt like giving up. A neighbor came by in October of that first year with a cardboard box that mewed when it moved. "Found these under my porch?" she said, lifting the lid to reveal 3 gray kittens, tiny and perfect, and blinking up at Jennifer with eyes that looked nothing like Sam's and everything like him at the same time. "Thought you might want one, since you're all alone out here." Jennifer looked at those kittens and felt her chest cave in. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She thrust the box back at the neighbor and turned away and pressed her hand against the doorframe to keep from falling, and she heard herself say, "No, I can't. Please take them away." and she heard the confusion in the neighbor's voice, and the awkward apology, and the sound of footsteps retreating down the porch stairs. And then she was alone again, shaking, gasping, crying with a violence that scared her because it came from somewhere so deep she didn't know it existed. She couldn't hold another cat. She couldn't feel another warm body in her lap, another heartbeat against her palm. She couldn't love something that completely, again, not when she knew how easily it could be taken, how quickly you could lose everything you'd built. She was done. She was finished. She would rather be lonely for the rest of her life than feel this kind of pain again. The food bowl stayed by the back door for 18 months. She knew it was irrational. She knew he wasn't coming back. But she couldn't bring herself to pick it up, to carry it to the trash, to admit that he was gone and the bowl was never going to be filled again. It sat there gathering dust, and sometimes she would look at it and cry, and sometimes she would look at it and feel nothing at all, and she didn't know which was worse. She found one of his whiskers caught in the couch cushion in the spring of 2014, almost a year after he disappeared. It was gray and white, maybe 2 inches long, curved in that way cat whiskers are. She held it in her palm and stared at it for a long time, and then she got a small wooden box from her jewelry drawer, a box that had once held a pair of earrings her mother gave her, and she put the whisker inside and closed the lid and put the box on her nightstand. She didn't know why she was keeping it. She didn't know what it meant to save one whisker from a cat who was gone. But she couldn't throw it away. It was the only thing she had left of him. There was a thunderstorm in June that shook the windows and made the power flicker. Jennifer had never been afraid of storms, but Sam had hated them. He would press himself against her side and tremble until the thunder passed. On this night, she reached for him without thinking, her hand seeking the warm, furry body that had always been there when she was scared, and her hand found nothing, empty space, cold sheets, and she lay there in the dark, listening to the thunder and crying, not because she was afraid of the storm, but because she had forgotten, just for a second, that he was gone. And forgetting hurt almost as much as remembering. The second year was different, not easier exactly, but different. The sharp edges of grief began to dull, the way they do when you carry them long enough. She didn't cry every day anymore. Sometimes she went whole weeks without that sudden ambush of sorrow that could knock her sideways in the middle of an ordinary moment. She learned to live around the loss, the way you learn to live with a chronic injury, carefully, cautiously, always aware of the tender place that could flare up without warning. But hope was harder to kill than grief. In the third year, someone called to say they'd seen a gray tabby with white paws at a farm 3 towns over. Jennifer drove 40 miles in the rain, her hands shaking on the wheel, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She found the farm, found the cat, and stood there in the drizzle, staring at an animal that was not Sam. Wrong face, wrong eyes, wrong everything. The farmer said, "This isn't your cat, is it?" And Jennifer shook her head and walked back to her truck and sat there for a long time, waiting for her hands to stop shaking enough to drive home. The road back was the longest 40 miles of her life. She almost took down his food bowl that winter. 3 years was long enough. 3 years meant he wasn't coming back, meant he was dead, meant keeping the bowl was crazy, was pathetic, was the kind of thing people whispered about when they talked about the woman who lived alone on the farm outside Hollywood. She picked it up. She held it in her hands. She stood there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, feeling the weight of it, looking at the faded paw print design on the side that she'd picked out because she thought it was cute. And then she put it back. She couldn't do it. Not yet, maybe not ever. Grief isn't linear. It doesn't follow a schedule. Some days year 4 felt easier than year 1. Some mornings she'd wake up and barely think of him at all, and she'd feel guilty about that, like forgetting was a betrayal. Other mornings the loss would be fresh as the first week, and she'd move through the day like she was walking through water, everything heavy, everything hard. She stopped trying to predict it. She stopped trying to control it. She just let it come when it came and go when it went. And she survived. She dreamed about him sometimes. Dreams where he walked through the back door like he'd just been out for a long afternoon in the sun, annoyed at her for worrying, demanding dinner. Dreams where she could feel his weight in her lap, could hear his purr, could smell that particular Sam smell of warm fur and sunshine. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her face and an ache in her chest so profound it felt physical, because the dream had been so real she could still feel him, and waking up meant losing him all over again. Year 5, year 6. The sharp grief had faded to something duller now, an ache that lived in the background of her days. She went back to her pottery. She started going to the farmers' markets again. She talked to people, made something that resembled a social life, accepted dinner invitations from friends who had long since stopped asking if there was any news about Sam. She was functioning. She was moving forward. She was, by any reasonable measure, okay, but she still didn't hold any cats. Friends had cats, neighbors had cats. The farmers' markets were full of people who brought their cats along for reasons Jennifer never understood. And she would look at those cats and feel a door close inside her chest, and she would find reasons to keep her distance. She wasn't ready. She might never be ready. And that was okay. That was allowed. There was no timeline for grief, no deadline for healing, no rule that said you had to open yourself up to that kind of loss again just because other people thought you should. In the 7th year, something shifted. She was at a craft fair in Mount Pleasant, selling her pottery, when a woman stopped at her booth with a gray tabby on a leash. Jennifer's heart lurched the way it always did, but then something unexpected happened. Instead of looking away, she looked closer. She studied the cat's face, its markings, the way it moved. It was a beautiful cat, a cat someone loved, but it wasn't Sam. And for the first time in 7 years, realizing that didn't hurt. It just was. She laughed about him that night, for the first time since he disappeared. She was on the phone with an old friend, and somehow the conversation turned to pets. And Jennifer found herself telling the story of how Sam used to steal the butter off the counter, and she'd find him in the living room, butter all over his whiskers, looking offended that she'd interrupted. And she laughed, actually laughed. And then she stopped, surprised by the sound, because she hadn't known she was capable of that anymore, of remembering him with joy instead of only pain. The 8th year was the year she packed away his blanket. It had been on the foot of her bed since he disappeared, and for years she'd told herself she was keeping it there in case he came back. But she knew that wasn't true anymore. She knew he wasn't coming back, and she needed to stop pretending. She took the blanket off the bed one morning in spring. A soft fleece thing with a pattern of little fish on it. Ridiculous. She'd bought it at a dollar store years ago, and Sam had claimed it immediately as his own. She held it for a long time. She pressed it to her face and tried to smell him, but his scent was gone, had been gone for years, and she cried because that felt like another loss, another piece of him she'd never get back. And then she folded the blanket carefully, placed it in a plastic bin in the closet, and closed the door. That night, she slept better than she had in months. The bed felt different without the blanket there. Emptier, but also somehow cleaner. Like she'd finally acknowledged something true instead of pretending. Year 9, year 10. She had made her peace with it now, or something close to peace. She still talked to him sometimes out loud, but it was different than before. Before, she'd talk to him like he was coming back. Now she talked to him like he was gone, the way you might talk to a parent who'd passed or a friend you'd lost. Telling him about her life, asking what he would think, knowing he couldn't answer but finding comfort in the asking anyway. She didn't think of him every day anymore. Sometimes a whole week would pass before something reminded her. A gray cat in someone's yard, a bag of cat food on the shelf at the grocery store, a picture on social media that looked almost like him. The reminders still hurt, but distantly, the way an old scar hurts when the weather changes. Noticeable, but not debilitating. In the spring of year 10, she stood in her garden pulling weeds, and she stopped and looked around at her land. The pasture, the woods, the farmhouse she'd made into a home. And she thought, I'm okay now. And she meant it. The grief had become part of her, woven into who she was, but it no longer defined her. She had survived losing Sam. She would survive whatever came next. She even thought, for the first time in a decade, about getting another cat. She didn't do it. She wasn't ready for that, maybe wouldn't ever be, but she thought about it. She let herself imagine what it might be like to have another warm body in the house, another heartbeat in the silence. She let herself consider the possibility that loving again didn't have to mean forgetting Sam, that there was room in her heart for both. She didn't act on it, but she didn't shut it down immediately either, and that felt like progress. Year 11 came quietly. Jennifer was 67 years old now, her hair more gray than brown, her hands showing the wear of 30 years of working with clay. She had built a life, a small life, a quiet life, but hers. She had her pottery and her garden and her farmhouse and her solitude, and she had long since stopped waiting for anything to change. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some cats don't come home. She had accepted that. And then her phone rang. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in August of 2024. She was on the porch drinking her coffee, watching the hummingbirds fight over the feeder, thinking about nothing in particular. Her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, probably a scam, probably nothing worth interrupting her morning for. But something made her pick it up, some instinct, some pull she couldn't explain. A woman's voice, professional, matter of fact. Is this Jennifer Ravenel? Yes. Ma'am, I'm calling from Charleston County Animal Control. We have a cat here that was picked up yesterday from a feral colony. We scanned his microchip, and the registration information lists you as the owner. Jennifer's hand tightened on the phone. She felt her heart stutter. I what? The cat's name is listed as Sam. The chip was registered in 2011. Ma'am, is this your cat? The coffee cup slipped from her fingers. She didn't hear it shatter on the porch floor. She didn't feel the hot coffee splash across her feet. She was standing very still, frozen, her brain refusing to process what she was hearing. That's not possible. Sam has been missing for 11 years. A pause on the other end. Ma'am, I understand, but the microchip doesn't lie. We scanned it twice to be sure. The chip number matches your registration. If this is your cat, he's been found. Jennifer's legs wouldn't hold her. She sat down heavily on the porch steps, the phone pressed to her ear, her free hand braced against the wood to keep from falling over entirely. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. Her breath was coming too fast. She tried to speak and couldn't. Ma'am, are you there? I'm here. Her voice sounded strange, thin, like it was coming from very far away. You're sure? You're absolutely sure? I'm sure. Would you like to come see him? We're open until 6. The drive to the Charleston Animal Society took 45 minutes, but Jennifer couldn't remember a single mile of it afterward. She drove on autopilot, her hands gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles were white, her mind spinning between hope and terror and disbelief. Don't get your hopes up, she told herself. It might not be him. Microchips can be wrong. Databases can have errors. 11 years is impossible. Cats don't survive 11 years in the wild. This is a mistake. But what if it wasn't? She thought about all the times she'd imagined this moment, all the times she'd fantasized about finding him, bringing him home, having him back. She'd given up on those fantasies years ago because they hurt too much, because hoping was worse than accepting, because every time she let herself dream about his return, she had to lose him all over again when she woke up. She had trained herself not to hope, and now hope was flooding through her anyway, despite everything, unstoppable, terrifying in its intensity. Please, she thought, and she didn't know who she was praying to. Please let it be him. Please don't let this be another gray cat that isn't him. Please, after 11 years, let me have this. Let me have him back. The shelter was a low concrete building on the outskirts of Charleston, practical and institutional, not the kind of place that looked like it traded in miracles. Jennifer parked her truck and sat there for a long moment, unable to move. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. She felt like she might throw up or pass out or both. A shelter worker met her at the front desk, a young man with kind eyes who had clearly been told she was coming. Mrs. Ravenel, we have Sam in an intake room, if you'll follow me. She followed him down a hallway lined with cages. Dogs barked, cats meowed. The air smelled like disinfectant and animal and something else she couldn't name. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She kept one hand on the wall to steady herself. They stopped in front of a door with a small window. He's in here, the worker said. Take your time, there's no rush. Jennifer looked through the window, and the world stopped. He was thinner than she remembered, so much thinner. His coat was rough and patchy, and his face had the gaunt look of an animal who had known real hunger. He was sitting in a carrier with the door open, looking out at the room with an expression that was wary and exhausted, and something else, something that looked almost like waiting. But it was him. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. Not because of his markings, which could have belonged to any gray tabby. Not because of his size or shape, which had changed in ways that made her want to weep. She knew it because of his eyes. Those intelligent, watchful eyes that had looked at her from the crook of a tree 13 years ago. The eyes of the kitten who had trusted her enough to let her carry him down a ladder one-handed. The eyes of the cat who had slept at the foot of her bed for 2 perfect years, who had sat on the counter while she cooked, who had listened to her talk for hours without ever getting bored. Sam, the kitty cat man. She opened the door. Her hands were trembling so badly she almost couldn't turn the handle. She stepped inside the room and stood there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that if she did anything, he would disappear again. Sam looked up at her. His ears came forward. His whiskers twitched, and then he did something that broke her open completely. He started to purr. Jennifer dropped to her knees. She didn't decide to. Her legs just stopped working. She knelt on the concrete floor of that institutional room, and she held out her hand, and Sam walked out of the carrier and came to her. He pressed his head against her palm the way he used to do when he wanted attention. He rubbed his cheek against her fingers, leaving his scent, marking her as his. And he purred, that familiar rumble she hadn't heard in 4,015 days, the sound that had once been the background music of her entire life. She gathered him into her arms. He weighed almost nothing, 7.5 pounds, she would learn later, down from the 15 he'd weighed when he disappeared. She could feel every bone in his spine, every ridge of his ribs. He was fragile in a way he'd never been before, worn down by years of surviving on scraps and luck. But he was alive. He was here. He was purring against her chest, and she could feel the vibration of it spreading through her body like warmth, like light, like coming home. She was making sounds, but they weren't words, just sounds, sobs and laughter, and something between a moan and a prayer. She held him tighter than she should have, and he let her, pressing against her like he was trying to crawl inside her chest and stay there forever. "Sam," she finally managed to say. Sam, oh God, oh my God, it's you, it's really you." He looked up at her and meowed. One short, sharp sound that seemed to say, obviously, where else would I be? And she laughed through her tears, ugly crying, snot running down her face, not caring at all. The shelter staff were crying too. She could see them through the window in the door, watching, wiping their eyes. One of them was filming on a phone, and she didn't care about that either. Let them film. Let the whole world see. She had Sam back. After 11 years of grief, 11 years of emptiness, 11 years of a hole in her heart that nothing else could fill, she had him back. "I really thought y'all were playing a prank on me," she said later, when she could speak coherently. When the staff had come in and gathered around her like witnesses to something holy. Because it couldn't be possible, but this is a miracle in itself. She pressed her face against Sam's rough fur and felt his heart beating, fast and strong. "I haven't held a cat since he left, 11 years, because it broke my heart. And to feel his little heartbeat in there, oh gosh, it's the craziest thing that's ever happened to me." They told her where he'd been found, less than a mile from her property, living with a feral colony that had been feeding in the woods near a neighbor's land. Less than a mile. All those years she'd searched the woods calling his name, and he'd been right there, close enough to hear her maybe, close enough to smell her if the wind was right, but not close enough to find his way home. She would never know why he hadn't come back. Maybe the dog had scared him so badly he'd been afraid to return. Maybe he'd gotten lost in those first panicked moments and never figured out which direction led to safety. Maybe some feral instinct from his earliest days had taken over, teaching him to survive in the wild the way his ancestors had. She would never know. And she decided, sitting there on the floor of that shelter with Sam in her arms, that she didn't need to know. The why didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here. The drive home was the longest and shortest 45 minutes of her life. Sam was in a carrier on the passenger seat, a carrier the shelter had given her because she hadn't thought to bring one, hadn't dared to believe she'd need one. She kept reaching over to touch it, to feel the warmth of him through the mesh, to make sure he was still there. She talked to him the whole way, told him everything, told him about the years he'd been gone, about the grief that had nearly drowned her, about the food bowl she'd kept by the door and the blanket she'd finally packed away. She told him about her pottery, about the new kiln she'd bought 3 years ago, about the garden and the chickens, and the way the old oak tree where she'd found him had finally come down in a storm. She told him she'd never stopped loving him, never stopped missing him, never stopped hoping even when hope felt impossible. "You're never going outside again," she said, and she meant it like a vow. "Never. I don't care if you sit at the door and cry for the rest of your life. You're never going anywhere I can't find you. Do you understand me? You're home now, and home is where you're staying." Sam meowed once, softly, and she chose to believe that meant yes. When they pulled into her driveway, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked like something she might try to capture in a glaze someday. She sat in the truck for a moment, looking at her house, at the porch where she'd shattered her coffee cup that morning, at the door that Sam had walked out of 11 years ago and never walked back through. Until now. She carried his carrier to the porch, set it down, and opened the door. Sam stepped out slowly, cautiously, his nose working overtime to process all the smells. The porch, the wood, the jasmine on the trellis, the air of this place that had been his home once, a lifetime ago. He looked up at her, and she could have sworn she saw recognition in his eyes. Something that said, "Oh, yes, this." She opened the front door. "Welcome home, Sam." He walked inside like he'd never left. She watched him explore the house, moving from room to room, sniffing everything, rubbing his cheeks against the corners of furniture. He found his way to the kitchen, to the spot where his food bowl had sat for 18 months before she'd finally put it away. He sat down there and looked at her expectantly, and she laughed, actually laughed, because some things, apparently, didn't change. 11 years in the wild, and he still expected dinner to appear on schedule. She got out a can of cat food from the emergency supply she'd never quite been able to throw away. She put it in a bowl, not his old bowl, which was packed in a box somewhere she couldn't remember, and set it on the floor. Sam ate like a cat who had been hungry for a very long time, fast and focused, not stopping until the bowl was empty. She refilled it. He ate that too. When he was done, he sat back and began to groom himself with the careful intensity of a cat who finally had time for such luxuries. She watched him, crying silently, overwhelmed by the normalcy of it. A cat eating dinner, a cat grooming himself. The most ordinary things in the world, and the most miraculous. That night, she got ready for bed with Sam, following her from room to room, bathroom, bedroom, back to bathroom, when she forgot her glass of water. He was her shadow again, the way he'd been 13 years ago, unwilling to let her out of his sight for even a moment. She pulled back the covers and lay down, and she waited. Sam jumped up onto the bed, slowly, stiffly, showing his age. He walked across the mattress, found the foot of the bed, and curled up in the exact spot he had slept for 2 years before he disappeared. The spot where his blanket had been. The spot she had reached for on 1,000 lonely nights and found empty. He looked at her with those intelligent eyes, and he started to purr, and Jennifer lay there in the dark and cried until she had no tears left. She woke at 3 in the morning, the way she often did at her age, and for a moment she didn't remember. For a moment she thought it had been a dream, another dream like all the others, and she would reach down and find nothing and have to lose him again. But she reached down, and he was there, warm and real and solid, curled at her feet, purring even in his sleep. She kept her hand on him for a long time, feeling his heartbeat, feeling his breath, making sure, believing. And then she went back to sleep, and for the first time in 11 years, she slept without dreaming of loss. The weeks that followed were a kind of miracle in themselves. Sam settled back into life on the farm, like the intervening decade had been nothing more than a long afternoon nap. He had no interest in going outside, none at all. He would sit at the window and watch the birds in the yard. But if Jennifer opened the door, he backed away. The outside world had taken enough from him. He was done with it. She took him to a vet, a different one than before. The old one had retired, for a full checkup. The news was better than she dared to hope. Malnourished but recovering. Some dental issues from years of hard living. A touch of arthritis in his hips, but otherwise remarkably healthy for a 14-year-old cat who had spent more than a decade fending for himself. He might have several years left, the vet said. Good years if she took care of him. She intended to take very good care of him indeed. The video of their reunion went viral, millions of views on Instagram and Facebook. News stations picked it up, newspapers ran stories. Strangers from around the world sent messages that Jennifer didn't read because she didn't care. She had Sam, that was all that mattered. The rest was noise. She thought a lot about that microchip in the weeks after Sam came home. That tiny grain of rice that had cost $45 and taken 30 seconds to inject, just in case, the vet had said. And Jennifer, who didn't think she'd ever need it, who thought Sam would never go anywhere, had said yes anyway. Had said sure, just in case. That chip had saved his life, had saved her life in a way that was harder to explain but just as true. Without it, Sam would have been just another feral cat, another anonymous stray with no history and no one looking for him. The shelter might have adopted him out to someone else, or released him back to the colony, and Jennifer would have spent the rest of her life not knowing he had survived, not knowing he was right there, less than a mile away, waiting to be found. She tells everyone, now, everyone she meets, microchip your pets. Do it today. It costs almost nothing, and it lasts forever, and you never know when, just in case, might become the only thing standing between you and losing them forever. Sam is asleep right now, at the foot of her bed, in the spot that was empty for 11 years. She can hear him breathing, slow and steady. She can see his paws twitching sometimes, chasing something in his dreams. She hopes his dreams are good ones. She hopes they're full of warm sunlight and soft blankets, and the knowledge that he is home, he is safe, he is loved. She reaches down and touches his fur, feels the warmth of him, the weight of him, the impossible reality of him. 11 years she spent without this. 11 years of empty mornings and silent evenings, and a hole in her heart that nothing else could fill. And now he's here. Some miracles take time. Some miracles take 11 years of waiting, 11 years of grief, 11 years of refusing to give up, even when giving up was the only sensible thing to do. Some miracles look like a skinny gray cat with white paws, found feeding in a feral colony less than a mile from home, saved by a microchip no bigger than a grain of rice. His name is Sam the kitty cat man. And after 11 years of being lost, he finally found his way home. If his story reminded you that miracles still happen even after 11 years of waiting, subscribe for a new story every week. Each one is told with the same care, the same time, the same belief that some bonds are worth holding on to, no matter how long it takes. And if you have a pet, microchip them today. It's a small thing that can change everything. 11 years is a long time, but it's not forever.